July of 1944. World War II has not yet ended. Allied troops landed in Normandy barely a month ago. Millions of people are still dying on the fronts of Europe and the Pacific. And yet, at a mountain hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered to design something extraordinary, the economic system that will govern the world when the war is over. Two men dominate the conference. John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the century, represents Great Britain. Harry Dexter White, a U.S. Treasury official, represents the United States. Both want stability. Both want to prevent the economic chaos of the 30s from repeating. But their visions are fundamentally different. One of them will win. And his victory will define the architecture of the world economy for the next 3 decades. In the previous episodes, we saw how the crash of 1929 led to the Great Depression and how the New Deal attempted to respond at the national level. Now we jump to 1944. The war has demonstrated that the world's economies are connected. That the protectionism and competitive devaluations of the 30s had destroyed international trade and fueled conflict. World leaders are determined to build something better. A system of international rules to prevent the catastrophe from happening again. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods with an ambitious plan. He wanted to create a world central bank with the power to issue an international currency, which he called the Bancor. This currency would not replace national currencies but would serve to settle payments between countries. The World Central Bank could create bancors to inject liquidity into the global economy when needed. But the most radical part of Keynes's proposal was his treatment of trade imbalances. In his system, countries that accumulated large trade surpluses would be penalized, just like those that accumulated large deficits. The idea was that balance was everyone's responsibility, not just the debtor nations. White had a different vision. More modest institutionally, but more favorable to the United States. White proposed creating a stabilization fund, the International Monetary Fund, which would act more as an emergency fund than a central bank. Countries would contribute quotas and could borrow from the fund when they had balance of payments problems. But there would be no international currency and no world central bank. The fundamental difference was power. In Keynes's plan, no country would have a dominant position. In White's plan, the US dollar would be the central currency of the system. And given that the United States was the only major economic power that emerged from the war stronger than it had entered, it is not hard to guess which plan prevailed. What was agreed at Bretton Woods was essentially a version of White's plan with some concessions to Keynes. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, with a fluctuation margin of 1%. If a country needed to adjust its exchange rate, it could do so, but only with the approval of the International Monetary Fund. Two institutions were created. The International Monetary Fund would have the mission of overseeing the fixed exchange rate system and lending money to countries with temporary balance of payments problems. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which would later become the World Bank, would be tasked with financing the reconstruction of war-devastated countries and, later, the economic development of poor nations. The United States would contribute the largest quota to the International Monetary Fund and would therefore have the greatest voting power. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. The United States assumed responsibility for maintaining the dollar's value in gold. In return, it gained an extraordinary privilege, the ability to finance its deficits by issuing the currency everyone needed. Keynes, ill and exhausted, accepted the compromise. He died 2 years later, in 1946. There is a detail worth noting. Keynes's plan included a mechanism to penalize countries with persistent trade surpluses, forcing them to spend or lend their excess. The idea was that trade imbalances are a shared problem, not just the fault of the country that buys too much but also of the one that sells too much. This mechanism was rejected by the United States, which at that time was the world's largest creditor. Decades later, when the United States went from being a creditor to the world's largest debtor, many economists would recall Keynes's proposal with nostalgia. The absence of that symmetric adjustment mechanism remains, for many, one of the fundamental weaknesses of the international monetary system. Bretton Woods created the institutional framework. But Europe was in ruins. Factories destroyed. Infrastructure demolished. Millions of people displaced. Famine threatened in several countries. And without a rapid economic recovery, communism was gaining ground in elections in France, Italy, and Greece. In June of 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed something unprecedented, a massive program of American economic aid to rebuild Europe. The Marshall Plan, formerly the European Recovery Program, channeled approximately $17 billion between 1948 and 1952. To put that in perspective, that amount is equivalent to more than 250 billion in today's dollars. The money was used to buy machinery, raw materials, food, and fuel. But the Marshall Plan was not just charity or generosity. It had a clear economic logic. Europe needed to buy American products to rebuild, but it did not have the dollars to pay for them. The United States needed Europe to buy its products to keep its economy running. The Marshall Plan solved both problems simultaneously. The results were spectacular. Industrial production in Western Europe grew 35% between 1948 and 1952, surpassing pre-war levels by 25%. West Germany went from total devastation to becoming the world's third-largest economy in barely a decade. France, Italy, the Netherlands, all experienced growth that seemed miraculous. There was also an explicit geopolitical motivation. Containing the spread of communism in Western Europe. Economic aid was, in part, a weapon of the Cold War. But it worked on both fronts, economic and political. The Bretton Woods system worked extraordinarily well for more than 2 decades. Fixed exchange rates gave stability to international trade. Capital flows were regulated. Western economies grew at unprecedented rates. The French called it the 30 glorious years. The Germans, the economic miracle. But the system had a fundamental contradiction that the economist Robert Triffin identified as early as 1960. For the world to have enough dollars to finance international trade, the United States had to send dollars abroad, which meant running deficits. But if the United States ran growing deficits, the world would begin to doubt whether it could really convert all those dollars into gold. By the mid-60s, the amount of dollars circulating outside the United States already far exceeded American gold reserves. France, under de Gaulle, began demanding conversion of its dollars into gold, accusing the United States of abusing its privilege. In August of 1971, President Nixon made a drastic decision. He closed the gold window. The United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The central promise of Bretton Woods was broken. In 1973, fixed exchange rates were definitively abandoned. The world moved to the floating exchange rate system that remains in place today. Bretton Woods was dead. But the institutions it created, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, remain alive and central to the global economy. What is interesting is that nobody designed the system that came next. Floating exchange rates were not the result of a conference or a careful plan. They were the result of improvisation. Of the failure of what came before. Of the impossibility of sustaining a system whose contradictions had become unsustainable. And that new system, chaotic and without central design, turned out to be surprisingly durable. Floating exchange rates allow each country to adjust its monetary policy independently. But they also create volatility, uncertainty, and opportunities for currency speculation. It is an imperfect system. But after more than half a century, nobody has found a better one that everyone is willing to accept. For the generation that lived through the post-war years in Europe, Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan were not abstractions. They were food, employment, reconstruction. They were the difference between famine and recovery. In Germany, millions of people were living among rubble in 1945. The previous currency, the Reichsmark, was worthless. Barter had returned. American cigarettes had become the de facto currency. The monetary reform of 1948, which introduced the Deutsche Mark, and the arrival of Marshall Plan funds, transformed the situation within months. Stores that had been empty suddenly had products. People who had been surviving on the black market began finding work. But prosperity was not universal. The countries that ended up on the other side of the Iron Curtain did not receive Marshall Plan aid. The Soviet Union rejected it for itself and for the countries in its orbit. Europe was divided into 2 economic worlds, one rebuilding with American help, the other following the Soviet model of central planning. That division would have consequences lasting half a century. And we will see how it ended in a later episode of this season. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, Bretton Woods created an international monetary system based on fixed exchange rates, with the dollar pegged to gold. Keynes wanted something more egalitarian, but White's American vision prevailed. Second, the Marshall Plan was the largest economic aid program in history. $17 billion rebuilt Western Europe in 4 years, with both economic and geopolitical motivations. Third, the Bretton Woods system worked for 3 decades but collapsed when the amount of dollars in circulation exceeded American gold reserves. Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, and the world moved to floating exchange rates. Bretton Woods created a golden age of economic stability. But in 1973, a weapon nobody expected shattered the playbook. It was not financial or monetary. It was black, viscous, and came from beneath the ground in the Middle East. Oil. That, next time.